Okay, with all that being said, let's jump into this week's topic. This week's topic is what's working in local news. Obviously, this is a big thing that's kind of affecting the entire media sector. Of all the parts of the media that are suffering, local news over the last 20 years has probably suffered the most, whether it's because of the rise of Craigslist, local advertising being sucked up by Google and Facebook, and also just the continuing consolidation and buying up by major hedge funds, which, in order to squeeze more profits, have been laying off reporters and basically closing down print operations. So it's been a rough 20 years, but I feel like and we'll get into this discussing whether this is true, over the last few years, as someone who's been covering this space, I've seen so many bright spots, so many encouraging local news startups on both the for-profit and nonprofit side. It seems like the tide is starting to turn, that a lot of entrepreneurs are starting to find sustainable modes of local journalism, and we are going to basically focus on those success stories today. And to do that, we have two special guests. We have Dan Kennedy, who is a longtime professor of journalism at Northeastern University, and we have Ellen Clegg, who was previously the editorial page editor of the Boston Globe. And both of them have teamed up to do a number of things. One is to basically co-host a podcast where they interview successful local news entrepreneurs, but they've also written a book called, I don't know if this is the final title, but I think it's tentatively titled "What Works in Community News, Media Startups, News Deserts, and the Future of the Fourth Estate." And for that, they've basically spent I guess the past few years kind of interviewing and visiting successful newsrooms to figure out, what do they have in common, what are they doing that works. And so they're going to be sharing, even though it's not coming out until 2024, they're going to start sharing with us some of what they found during the research. So welcome, Ellen and Dan. I want to start off, like I always do, with sort of a macro question about local news. Obviously, we've seen a lot of turmoil in this sector over the last 20 years, but we're seeing now lots of these cool experiments sprouting up on both the for-profit and nonprofit side. Did you both feel like we're seeing a resurgence in local news over the next 10 years? Like, do you think that this is a real bona fide trend, that sustainability is coming back to the sector, and we're going to start seeing a shrinking of news deserts? Dan, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Simon, and thanks to everybody for showing up. Ellen and I are really looking forward to talking with you about our work. I've actually been reporting on this space since around 2008, 2009. And back then, I was looking at some pioneering projects such as the New Haven Independent, the Batavian in central New York, Voice of San Diego, and a few others. The need was great even then. And I really did think at that point that we were going to see an explosion of such projects starting from that point. And we really didn't. And part of it was because for a few years, the IRS made it very difficult for nonprofits to attain 501c3 status. And part of it was because I guess that, except in a few places with a few visionaries, the time wasn't really quite right. So, yeah, I think Ellen and I would probably both agree with you that in the last 3 to 5 years, that there really has been an incredible explosion of these projects. And I would say that most of the projects that we're looking at, not all of them, but most of them are of pretty recent vintage as a result of that.
Yeah, and I wonder if part of it too is just like the web hadn't matured enough to, a lot of these like online payment systems that are make it really easily to do memberships and stuff like that. It's not that they didn't exist, but they were expensive, enterprise projects. Whereas today, like, there were a few Substack local news entrepreneurs on this very call. Like, there's just a lot of more kind of free software and the tools necessary to do it that maybe didn't exist in like 2012, 2013. Ellen, what do you think? What's your level of optimism over the next 10 years or so?
Well, I'm from Minneapolis, and in 2009, Min Post was started by some people who left or were laid off the Star Tribune, which changed hands multiple times, went through bankruptcy. So I was intrigued by it, but they were a pioneer, much like the Texas Tribune, same vintage. I think another thing that's happened, Simon, is that broadband is much more pervasive, easier to access now than it was back then. People have the big pipes, even in rural areas, although that's a challenge. And I think the iPhone has made a difference too. People consume news on their phones. They're newsletter friendly, as I get a number of Substacks that I read on the app.
Mm-hmm. And maybe also the paradigm shift as well, in the sense of, the New York Times kind of paved the way to proving that people will pay for news, especially digital news, whereas like back in 2012, everybody just assumed that like nobody would ever pay for digital news, and it would have to be, there would only be one business model going forward.
That's a good point, although I should say that most of the projects that we're looking at, not all, but most of them are nonprofit, and most of them offer their journalism for free. So in that respect, that hasn't changed. But you also make a good point about people being willing to pay for news. I know that one of the projects that I looked at, the Colorado Sun, as Corey Hutchins well knows, has a very sophisticated, multi-layered payment system that just wouldn't have been possible at all a few years ago.
Yeah, and we'll get into the kind of nuts and bolts of that. I guess one thing I'd love to just start with, now that we've answered kind of the macro question of the direction, is just like, how did you research your book? Like, from what I understand from talking to Ellen on the phone a few weeks ago, you specifically honed in on a few newsrooms and then either visited them or interviewed them, like kind of in depth. How did that process work?
Dan has the best
Ellen.
COVID-related story, so he should start.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a good one. Early on in our reporting, I would say that most of our reporting took place between mid 2021 and mid 2022. But very early on in our reporting, we knew that we wanted to do the Mendocino Voice. They were very interesting to us because they had started as a for-profit and they were hoping to transition to a cooperative. Now, unfortunately for the book, they ultimately chose not to do that, although they may in the future. But anyway, I was out there during the first week of March in 2020. And so as the week was going on, I was texting my wife and saying, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get back. Everything's starting to shut down. Flights are being canceled. And I actually attended my very first COVID news conference while I was out there. And when we got back and everything shut down, Ellen and I knew that we wanted to visit every place we were writing about. And we knew that, first of all, we weren't going to be able to travel. And second, we weren't really sure how many of the projects we wanted to look at were going to survive the pandemic. So our editor at Beacon Press agreed to let us just take as long as we wanted before we started reporting again. And that's what we did. And I remember that there was an afternoon, oh, maybe in the spring of 2021, where Ellen and I just put a bunch of projects up on a whiteboard and said, okay, which ones do we really want to do? And there were hundreds to choose from, and any one of them would have been good. So we were looking for geographic diversity. We were looking for projects that covered communities of color as well as more typical affluent suburbs, which unfortunately is where a lot of these projects do fairly well. And we were looking for a diversity of business models, and we finally came up with the list that that we ended up reporting on.
And you visited all of them and to kind of see what works. Ellen, what was, out of all the ones you visited, which one impressed you the most?
That's a hard question to answer because they're all impressive in different ways. I was very taken with MLK 50 in Minneapolis. I'm sorry, in Memphis. Wendy Thomas, who had been a longtime columnist for the Memphis Commercial Appeal, was a Nieman Fellow in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and she incubated an idea. She wanted a one-year project focusing on communities of color on the mission that Martin Luther King had, rallying workers during his last visit to Memphis. She thought it was going to be a one-year project. She borrowed $3,000 from friends and family and lived off credit cards so she could pay freelancers, and the Commercial Appeal had gone from a storied Mid-South newspaper with a newsroom of 250 to under Gannett. It's got 27 reporters covering a city of 600,000. And Wendy is quite fierce. She was the only employee, and she launched an investigative project investigating predatory debt practices by a Methodist hospital in Memphis. She won the Selden Ring Award, and which is, for those who don't know, is a highly prestigious investigative award for investigative journalism. And then the funding began to pour in. The funders took notice. She now has a newsroom of 6. It's run by women of color, and they've done environmental work. They've covered police brutality. They're focused on economic justice. It's not a bundle with like school sports and things like that, but it's making a difference.
And are the funding sources largely like larger donors?
The funding sources are, it's a mix, but it's mostly larger philanthropies, because Wendy was a hard-charging columnist. She feels that that maybe she annoyed some people, spoke truth to power to some of the Memphis funders, so she has Knight, she just got a big award from the Knight Foundation. And however, she also has funding from FedEx in Memphis. So it's a real mix. She does not have a paywall. She feels that, Memphis is a majority Black city. The median income, household income, is about $48,000. So she is looking at small donors from Memphians.
Yeah. Nikki, do you have any I know you had a question about funding. What would you like to hear more about on the funding side?
Specifically in the nonprofit sector, I would love to just hear any funding ideas. I know that probably out of the organizations that you studied, there are probably a variety of different ways that people got funding. I'm a one-person organization, and so it's hard to make this work sustainable, but I also feel the necessity for the work. So just trying to sort of introspect a little bit, and now asking for for input on how to achieve that balance.
Do you mean like large funding sources or from individual readers?
I think both. I mean, the kind of questions that I had were like, what are people doing to generate subscription funding from individuals? But also what other sources have people used? What are some organizations that are interested in funding small journalism operations?
Yeah, Dan. So one thing I've noticed with interviewing a lot of these local news entrepreneurs, especially the small operations, is that they don't have a paywall, as Ellen mentioned, but they're still generating a significant amount of membership revenue. So speaking to kind of Nikki's question, how are they balancing that divide of not having, a paywall to push people into converting into funders, like how do they kind of, what's their kind of way of enticing readers into actually paying for the journalism?
Well, Nikki, did you say that you're from a for-profit? I think you said
Well,
it was non-profit.
technically, yeah, technically it's a for-profit. Now ask me how much profit I've made over the last 18 months. But yes, we're not registered as a nonprofit.
Okay. It's a great question. There are a variety of approaches that we've seen, but I think that Ellen and I would agree that the for-profit space is a real slog. It's harder than the nonprofit space at the moment. When I started reporting on this 15 years ago, I thought that the for-profits would figure out a better path to sustainability than they have up till this point. But it continues to be very difficult. Ellen and I recently had on our podcast Howard Owens of the Batavian, who was actually one of the first people I interviewed for an earlier book of mine back in 2009. And he has made a go of it as a free for-profit for a long time now. But it's a small operation. I believe he's the only full-time person. His wife does some work. He's got some freelance help. Um, it's been he makes a significant amount of revenue, but he doesn't have to divide it up too many different ways. I don't know if you've seen the Batavian, it's the Batavian.com. You probably won't come away thinking it's a beautiful site. He has 150 different ads on the homepage, and it's everything. It's everything from the local bank to restaurants to tattoo shops and everything else. And that's been very successful for him. He recently started something else, which was totally innovative. I've never heard of this before, but he now has a paid program where if you become a paid member of the Batavian, you'll get the news in real time, just like you always have. But the new wrinkle to this is that if you don't become a paid member, it won't pop up for you for, I think it was 4 to 6 hours. I can't remember exactly what. And and um and it was off to a pretty good start, and that was providing him with yet another source of revenue. And then a final point that I want to make about revenue sources for for-profits that Ellen and I have run into at a number of different projects. This kind of makes them not pure for-profits, they're kind of hybrids, but a number of them are raising nonprofit money, either through an organization that they set up or through a third party. And those donations can be used to support certain types of public interest reporting um, on as part of their for-profit mission. So that's really what I've got. And I would also say, if I was starting a for-profit local news project, I would probably just charge. I'd just say, you want to read it, you gotta pay.
Well, one thing I'm noticing both on the for-profit and nonprofit side is that the way that they're if they are trying to entice people into becoming members without having a paywall, is they have to emphasize two things. One, that it's locally owned, that this isn't just some corporate entity. This is a real person, a local small business owner who is, just trying to meet ends or have ends meet. And then two, that just talking about impact, like saying, I'm making sure that you have a voice, or you have ears at every city council meeting, at every board of supervisors meeting, and just talking through the impact and talking about the cost of producing this journalism, and just really doing what NPR or public radio and public television is, and just saying, like, this is what your money is paid for. I did this investigation of the local news, the spending at the local schools, things like that. Ellen, have you noticed in terms of like the communicating impact when you're trying to get, whether it's donors or paid members, either on the for-profit or nonprofit side?
Yeah, so I should note that I joined a group of people in Brookline, Massachusetts, last summer, a year ago, we're a nonprofit. We launched the Brookline.news news as a newsletter in April, and we stood up a website in May, just before town elections and town meeting. And we are a nonprofit, but we are looking at a mix of revenue that includes perhaps sponsored newsletters, and I think the sponsorship model for newsletters, the Globe has really monetized, which is a for-profit company on its best day. And the Globe has really leveraged newsletters and sponsorship of newsletters. Events are events are being tried. It's Brookline.news. We are, I did a sort of a poll of journalists I used to know, publishers, executives in the greater Boston area, to ask, what penetration rate do you need in a newsletter to be attractive to a local sponsor, a sort of a Brookline Booksmith or a bank? And the answer came back pretty much 30%. So if you can show that you've grown your email list and show impact that way, that might be attractive to local sponsors.
So I know there are a few questions in the chat. Just one follow-up is that we've been talking about for-profit versus nonprofit. If you were advising, so, maybe a reporter who quit their job at the local Gannett papers, thinking of starting their own local publication, and they were trying to decide over going nonprofit or for-profit route, what kind of advice would you give? Because I've talked to some local news entrepreneurs, and they were like, well, I thought about going the nonprofit route, but there was just a lot of regulatory hurdles I had to go over. I had to have like a board of directors and do this kind of reporting and on my finances and all that stuff. And I just found it was just like 10 times easier just to go the for-profit route. Dan, what kind of advice would you give on that front and choosing one over the other?
Well, certainly the ease of setting up a for-profit is very attractive. I mean, you can set it up and start publishing tomorrow if that's what you want to do. But I think you will have quickly found out that you've kind of boxed yourself into a corner, because there's more levers you can pull for revenue with the nonprofit route. And I would say take it a little more slowly and do the nonprofit. There's a lot of work to it. I live in Medford, Massachusetts, and we were left completely bereft by Gannett about a year and a half ago. And about a half dozen of us got together to talk about trying to set up a nonprofit. And it turns out it's a lot of work. We met with Ellen, actually, who told us some of the things that she had been through in Brookline. And we just realized that none of us had the time to put into organizing something like that. And we are hopeful that we have attracted a for-profit publisher to setting up in Medford, but there hasn't been an announcement yet. So again, I would say that for-profit, it's easier to get started, but I think the nonprofit is more sustainable, not just in the long run, but even in the short and medium run.
Just mainly because there are tax write-offs and you're able to apply for grants and stuff like that? Like, is that the main reasoning?
Yeah, I mean, that's really it. If you're going to go the for-profit route, you're pretty much stuck with advertising, and we all know what's happened to advertising. It's just a really, really tough road.
Yeah. Sam, you had a question. Sam, going once.
I had a question about the headcount, but then I also just wanted to bring a little bit of attention to the fiscal partnership that we have with the local media foundation, because it's a super easy lift for us. We don't have to deal with any of the tax deductible, this or that paperwork. And I think Nikki was pointing out the Tiny News Collective also offers fiscal partnership. So you really don't have to choose. There's certain guidelines or whatever, but we're a for-profit that takes, $2,500 tax deductible checks now.
So you are able to be a for-profit, but they donate to some separate organization who acts as the nonprofit kind of middleman or something like that?
Basically, we really just get to borrow their tax status. They actually set up a fundraising page for us so we can, send that specific link to people. We don't really advertise it. It's more of when we get those, people that want to do more, but would like, larger donors are actually more concerned about tax deductibility than somebody who gives $20 a month. So when we have that like person who's like, oh, I'm a successful lawyer, I'd like to do more. Like, what can I do? That's when we send them the link to this page.
And is that available to anybody or only businesses that are local to you?
So the local media association seems to be pretty open. There's also the Alt Weekly association. They're doing a similar thing too. So there's a couple people that you can choose from now. So we have to like vet people pretty carefully, and we met with like four different industry associations and one local place that does this sort of thing now.
Yeah, it'd be awesome if you could drop that link in the chat. And then you also you had a question about what was the largest headcount of the organizations that Ellen and Dan studied. Can you guys answer that one?
I know the
Sure,
largest one I looked at. How about you, Ellen?
sorry, I stepped on you, Dan.
No, I just said I know the largest I looked at, but I was wondering what the largest was that you looked at.
Texas Tribune in Austin has, don't hold me to it, but about 60 people. And it actually, because it's in Austin and very focused on state news, it has the largest state house bureau in the United States. The Daily Memphian in Memphis, which is the other digital startup in Memphis, has about 40 people in their newsroom.
Wow, that's huge.
Probably the largest I looked at was the Colorado Sun, which was a couple of dozen when I left off with them. I think they've continued to grow since then. That's with an asterisk, because another project I looked at was NJ Spotlight News, which has, I think it's about 6 to 8 people working on the digital side, but they merged with a public broadcaster down there. So now they have a combined newsroom of maybe, 60 or 70 people. And, I'll go all the way down to a couple I looked at that were 1.5 people.
Yeah, and I encounter a lot that are just maybe 2 people tops, and maybe the one person does the editorial and the other person does kind of a little bit more on the business and admin side. Glenn, you had a question that I was going to ask in the future, so how about you just pop in with that one if you're available?
Sure. Here, I'll turn my camera back on. From a content perspective, what are some of the commonalities you've seen among the more successful startups?
Yeah, and to kind of piggyback on what Glenn's talking about, what we're saying, some of these newsrooms only have 2 or 3 people, so they have to be really economical in what they cover. And obviously there are a lot of different niches. What do you see as being the most important to what Glenn's talking about, the most important coverage areas?
Well, I'll jump in. It's different in every community, and I think the most successful places have conducted research and listening tours, really going to coffee shops or grocery stores, gathering places, talking to people. Dan and I just talked to Walter Robinson today. He's a longtime Globe investigative reporter. He was the leading Spotlight when they investigated clergy sexual abuse. And Robbie, as he is known, is advising the New Bedford Light in Massachusetts and the Plymouth Independent, which is brand new. The first act, and the Independent is a nonprofit, is that they have conducted a community survey of 257 people to ask what they're missing, what they want to see. And they are launching or going to launch an ambassador program, recruiting community members for constant feedback.
Yeah, I've seen even this with like writer collectives where they've actually recruit like members of the community to be part of the collective, like the buy-in's like $1 or something, so that they're getting constant feedback on what they should be covering. Dan, what do you think?
I've seen a split between projects that go very hard on local accountability journalism. And like you mentioned earlier, Simon, hitting every town council or city council meeting, every school committee meeting, and really just forming a net over that. And on the other hand, projects that step back a little bit and focus on deeper kinds of investigative reporting. We've really seen both. And I think that the deeper takes work best in places where there's already a legacy news organization that is still doing at least a decent job of doing a lot of the day-to-day stuff. What we tend not to see, and I think this is a problem, frankly, Steve Waldman of Rebuild Local News recently wrote a piece for Pointer where he was talking about the importance of really the minor, not minor, but the details of everyday life that we take for granted, obituaries, school sports, anniversaries, things like that. And I think that among a lot of the projects that we've looked at, you don't see an awful lot of that. They are very serious. And I frankly think some of them need more of a sense of fun. Um, I'll give you one example. I wrote about the New Haven Independent quite a few years ago. We went back there because the project has changed. And one of the major ways that it's changed is that when I was reporting on them 15 years ago, they weren't doing much in the way of arts and culture reporting. Now they do a lot. And they've also added a community radio station that features a lot of arts and culture and just community life. And as a result, I think it's a better project. And I think a number of these projects ought to step back a little bit and say, well, okay, we're doing a good job with serious meat and potatoes journalism, but are we really reflecting the full life of the community in all of its different dimensions? They're less good at that than they are at the serious stuff.
I'd be interested in hearing from Farhan and Scott Broadbeck as two people who have mostly funded through advertising and are for profit. In terms of, is it important if you are monetizing through advertising, is it more important to devote resources to the business community as part of that model? Farhan, or Scott, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I'm also like kind of laughing at what Dan was just saying about like the fun side of it. And I think that's, I don't know, like it seems to be that's the hardest thing for local reporters and journalists to like actually grasp. And you see it. And so it's interesting because like we're always doing polls and asking readers, you know, what is it that they're looking for? What do they want? And there's like this sense of like they want local news, but like they also want the local events and the things to do and these things. And like we ran a poll recently, and those two items were neck and neck. And then it was like restaurants, in-depth investigative reporting was like, I think it got like 10% of the polls. And so it was really interesting in that way to look and say, like, this is what people want. And I think in that local space, like we as an industry forget that people say they want news, but they actually want these other things because that affects them on a daily basis. It's why the unsexy local news stuff works. It's like the garbage pickups and the roads and the potholes. It's the things that affect people's lives on a daily basis. So if we start with that, then like you see that clear path to loyalty and people coming back and engagement and all of that. But it seems like that's probably one of the biggest misses right now, is like this hard line in the sand to say, well, that's the quote unquote fluff, but you know, that's also what people are telling us they want. So let's give them what they're telling us they want. Why is that so hard?
Some of the most engaging stories are the local popular or the popular food chain coming to some, you know, local empty, you know, office space or something like that. Like
so like anecdote on that. and we've been trying to get our team to really understand this, and we'll probably be making some changes to templates and all that. But we're finding that consistently with some of our biggest newsletters, you'll see anywhere from, so if we have newsletters that have, let's say, 10 to 50,000 subscribers in them, you'll see somewhere between 2,000 and 6,000 clicks on any given one. You put a food story in there, and all of a sudden that spikes to like 8, 9, 10,000, and like it's just astronomical. And so it's like looking at that data to say, and we've been talking about this internally, like, should we just be investing more on food and events and like going really hard on that? Should we actually scale back on the news? It's things that we're talking about.
Yeah, Scott, you run a for-profit advertising focused local news or series of local news outlets. How much do you prioritize business news in that mix?
Yeah, I just want to agree with everything that was just said. I think ultimately our mission here is to connect with readers, not to do it in a cynical way, but that, big, local town council or whatever piece, if no one's reading it, then what's the point? So, and fundamentally the value we provide is the audience, whether you're selling advertising or whether you're selling memberships or ideally doing all those things plus more, you need an audience. And so having a I describe it as a well-balanced diet of local news, the meat and potatoes, the dessert, some of the vegetables, and, it runs the gamut. And one thing that's very vexing about local as a space is that each place is different. The desires of readers in Vancouver are going to have some commonalities with the desire of readers in Arlington, Virginia, where I am, but not totally. And so, one approach does not work everywhere. But what you need to do is you need to approach it from a standpoint of, I want to keep my readers informed about the things that matter to their lives, as was said. And once you can do that, once you can build enough of an audience, the business model does follow. Now, to what degree does that follow? I think that varies. And I don't think we're ever going to build things the size of what existed because of this very, what we had before was this very unique time where newspapers had basically a monopoly over distribution, to their community, and that allowed them to have all these very easy revenue streams. Now you really have to work for it. Not only do you not have the guaranteed distribution of sending out a whole bunch of print newspapers, if you're online only. Not only do you have to work harder to get the readers, but you also have to work harder to get your revenue sources. You don't have those classifieds just flowing in by existing. But it's not impossible. And my prediction of what we're going to see going forward is that people are going to start figuring it out. Like there are going to be more organizations like News Revenue Hub that are going to allow more news organizations, especially on the nonprofit side, to come up and effectively raise money. I think we're going to be seeing stuff like that on the advertising side as well eventually, although it's taken a while to get there, and it's hard to make that work just because of the aforementioned, every place is different. But I think we're going to get there, and I think there's a lot of doom and gloom in this space, and I just fundamentally believe that the demand is there. People want to know about what's going on in their community. And the local advertisers have not gone away. They are still there. And if you give them a good way to reach people, that's going to be effective in generating advertising revenue. So, I really appreciate what Dan and Ellen do on their podcast and with this book. I think sometimes, if I may offer a constructive criticism, I think sometimes it over-indexes a bit in terms of looking at some of the more traditional business models and the more, call it NPR-like coverage, as opposed to what we do, which is a little more broad-based audience focus, let's call it. But look, the focus on this space is important, and I appreciate what they're doing.
Yeah.
We're,
Well,
we're always looking for podcast guests, so please pitch us.
yeah, and I can say Scott, he's been on my podcast before. He's a very good and eloquent speaker. Farhan as well. So you should definitely exchange contact information. Keith, you were talking about how you inserted kind of like a personality, a voice in your newsletters. How did that kind of manifest itself, and what kind of benefits did you see from that?
Well, I just agree with what Dan was saying about bringing more fun to, I just think that current younger audiences are just a little bit more casual in how they consume news. And I think, at least in our market, there was a real heaviness, the continuum that I described between public safety and local government development board on one side, and then restaurants, real estate, especially in the Atlanta market. People love real estate. It's the only thing in the US, I think, that you can be voyeuristic about, right? Everyone loves to see what other people pay for houses. So that type of content just does really well for us. And then we can give them the medicine of the local government, the public safety, the education in there. And then the newsletter, the timing was good when we launched here in Atlanta, because Axios wasn't here yet. There wasn't really a newsletter like, the Skim or the Morning Brew. And I just think that they're so effective and relatively easy to do because the playbooks are out there, right? The Hustle, the Morning Brew, they put their whole business plan online. So you don't have to start from scratch. Just go take what other people are doing and put your own local twist on it. And people have reacted really well. So that's what I just wanted to really, give a cheer to what Dan was saying about lightening things up a little bit, because the world is so heavy right now. And especially in our market where we are in Atlanta, there's so much going on that just stresses people out, that we need to listen to our customers. We need to give them the vitamins and the vegetables, but I think we need to do it in a way that makes it go down a little bit easier.
Yeah,
I
I agree. And
can I add on to that?
Sorry, who?
Nikki.
Nikki, yeah, sure. Nikki.
Is it okay if I add on to that?
Sure.
Can I just say one more thing, Nikki, before to tee you up a little bit?
Yeah.
But the other thing too is we put emojis in our newsletter, and you would have thought that I created emojis in Atlanta, which I didn't. But so I just want to tee that up because it sounds like Nikki's in the same space that we are. So I just wanted to say, like, that just adds, I don't know what, it makes it so much easier for people to consume.
Yeah, I mean, people just want to read things that are relatable, right? They want to read things that they feel like are written for them and not for an academic paper. And as somebody who, a lot of my experience was writing academic papers before I became a writer, that was a shift for me, but it's something that I consistently get complimented on in the community when I'm out. It's like, oh, you make your things so relatable and so understandable, and distilling really complicated topics down into a 3-minute newsletter is there's certainly something that's really appreciated. And if you can do it with just a teeny tiny bit of humor, that's even better.
Farhan, you had a question?
Yeah, I was just like on top of like all of that, seeing if anyone has had the opposite reaction. So this idea on like, casual language, it seems like it's something that I don't know, has like some strong opposition, that especially thinking like an older demographic doesn't want that. And what I'm seeing, like the complete opposite, is that when you speak in fun tones and languages, like when appropriate, and actually I would rephrase that, when you use that all the time and you be serious when appropriate, the engagement is like drastically higher. But I'm curious if anyone's seeing the opposite effect of like when maybe not to do that.
Can I make just an anecdotal observation about that? Last year, the Boston Globe unveiled a new morning newsletter called The B-Side.
Yeah.
Which is extremely breezy, lots of emoticons, emojis. And I signed up to take part in a test of it. And, I'm old, I'm in my 60s. And at the end of it, they gave you a survey and asked a bunch of questions. And then they said, please describe the age category that you are in. And they had 6 different age categories, and the final one was something like 35 and older. The others were, 20 to 25, 25 to 30. It's like, so, I think that there's a sense that that kind of approach is more geared toward trying to attract younger readers.
Brian, you had a question for Dan and Ellen.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm a general manager of a public radio station in Reno, previously a newspaper editor. It was a Gannett paper here in town. And I guess my experience over the last year since coming into the sort of the NPR member station system has been sort of this relatively recent spirit of collaboration across member stations, but more, how do we broaden that collaborative spirit? Right now, I mean, broadly speaking, it's a pretty ad hoc type approach where it works where it works. We're part of the Mountain West News Bureau, which is a CPB funded collaboration between member stations across the Mountain West. So Reno, Boise, Colorado, Utah, et cetera, where we all sort of share content and reporters, and we sort of broadcast all the stories regardless of where we are. But and Dan, thanks for sharing that link about that response to that Shorenstein Center paper about public radio's future and how it might replace what's been lost with the decline of newspapers. The main point being that we're not great at hyper local. We're pretty good at regional, which I would agree with. It's hard to get. I have 5 reporters in my station, for example, which is a far cry from when at the peak of the RGJ, we had dozens, right? So yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just looking for if there's any experiences out there with anyone on this call who's partnered with public media. If you've seen sort of fruitful relationships blossom where there's been content sharing or ways to kind of just replace what's been lost, especially when it comes to local government coverage too, which is a major concern that I have.
We have a shared calendar with the local NPR station. So it's an events calendar that's free for anyone to put events into, and goes to a third-party site that we co-branded. So it links from both of our pages. And then we also do a weekly podcast with them on the events. So that's been a good way for us to do it. And then we, from time to time, because we still have print monthly. So from time to time, we'll run an NPR story in print, which gives them, it's not an exclusive, it's not breaking news because we're only monthly, but it gives them distribution in a different format that they wouldn't otherwise have. So we've had some success in that way.
Interesting.
We've seen a number of takeovers and mergers, which isn't quite the same thing that you're asking for, but I know that Colorado Public Radio acquired Denverite, which gives them more of a local focus in Denver. WHYY in Philadelphia acquired Billy Penn, and there's been a few others. And then one of the projects that we're taking a deep look at is NJ Spotlight News, which was a politics and public policy website covering state government in New Jersey, that a few years ago actually merged with New Jersey Public Television. And they continue to have text-based coverage on the web, but they've also combined that with a half-hour daily newscast that often features people from the digital side. And so, those aren't, I don't know that you'd call those collaborations so much as takeovers, but nevertheless, they do represent public media stepping up in a pretty interesting way and doing something that goes beyond their traditional mission of either being just on the radio or on television.
Yeah, and I know like lots of random public radio and public TV have partnerships where a reporter will come from a local news organization will come on. Like for instance, the local public radio station in DC, they have someone from the Capitol Weather Gang, which is the Washington Post, come on and do kind of like the daily weather forecasts and stuff like that. But a lot of that is ad hoc. Corey, I know you had a few questions in the chat. Anything you wanted to bring up in our remaining few minutes?
Yeah, thanks. I'm curious about local media ecosystems, and I know that you're looking at what's working when it comes to individual outlets, but I wonder what you might have found similar or different in some states, regions, or cities where local nonprofits or statewide or national nonprofits or groups have gotten together to kind of create what they call ecosystem builders or something to help a lot of news organizations thrive. It's something that I know is happening here in Colorado where I live, and often wonder where else that might be happening. I know you looked at Colorado, so did you see that anywhere else? And what might you have seen that was unique here when you did?
You
Ellen,
know, Ellen and I, and maybe Ellen should probably speak to this as well. We just find that in looking at local and regional news and the problems and the solutions for that crisis, is that so many researchers are looking at it from 10,000 feet. And we kind of deliberately decided not to do that. So we really looked at the individual projects that we chose, and we would look at them in terms of the ecosystem in that area. But we really were not spending a lot of time and effort looking at some of these large organizations that are trying to recharge local news. That said, I did want to point out to you, Corey, I don't know if you knew this, but the National Trust for Local News, which of course did so much in Colorado to prevent that group of weekly and monthly newspapers from falling into hedge fund hands, they may be involved in efforts to convert the Portland Press Herald in Maine and its associated newspapers into a nonprofit organization. So that's something that we're watching at the moment. But I'm just blathering. I'm wondering what Ellen.
Yeah, Ellen, what do you think?
Dan, I'm used to that, but no, no, it's I talked to people at the American Journalism Project and at Night quite recently, and they are pivoting really to focus on these ecosystems, building out statewide ecosystems. I sense that they're just getting started to figure out what that will look like without reinventing Gannett. Dan mentioned the National Trust, which is also, as he mentioned, the Globe reported there looking at Maine. They might be, everything's in stealth mode right now, but so I think you're going to see more of that. ProPublica has a great program for small newsrooms where you can apply to be paid by ProPublica for a year and work on, somebody in your newsroom can work on a major investigative story that then is published on the ProPublica site and the local site. But you don't want to reinvent Gannett.
Yeah. And obviously there are lots of national organizations like Lion and stuff like that's providing support. Shauna, you had a question about co-ops. Is she on mute? Shauna, going once. So Shauna asked,
sorry.
oh,
Hi,
yeah.
sorry, I'm in the car.
Yeah, that's okay. Sorry about that.
Don't drive off
No
the
worries.
road.
Yeah, no, I'm stopped now. So cooperatives, I know I'm in Canada, and I know that a group of French-speaking newspapers came together that were floundering and became a co-op, and each individual newspaper is a co-op, and then there is a collective co-op where they share resources and they share obviously stories and information. And it seems to be operating quite well. It's being kind of held up as an example in the cooperative space as far as a financial model. And I'm just curious if any of those are operating in the US in a regional capacity or even state capacity. I'm really interested in that with a combination of radio and newspaper online news.
Yeah, I haven't seen it really. I've never seen it before where a bunch of news organizations join a co-op. I thought you were asking more about like writer co-ops, like news organizations where there's like co-ownership. Have Dan and Ellen, have you noticed anything on that front in terms of what about the writer collect? What about the wider writer co-op? Were any of the news organizations that you profiled like cooperatives?
No, and this is something I've reported on for years, and it's of great interest to me, and it just hasn't happened. I covered efforts in Haverhill, Massachusetts, to form a news co-op for probably 10 years, and they never got beyond the early fundraising stage, and they finally decided to abandon it. I think I mentioned earlier that I was originally interested in the Mendocino Voice because they were going to become a co-op. And then COVID hit, one of the co-founders left, and it now looks like they're going to become a traditional nonprofit. There was what looked like a successful cooperative arts magazine in Akron, Ohio called The Devil Strip that fell apart. And it turned out that the founder, the people who were in the co-op, when they looked into the finances, they found that the founder had taken the money he had gotten to organize the co-op and put it all into operating expenses. And when the money was gone, there was no more money to keep the Devil Strip going. Tom Stites, who is kind of an expert on news co-ops in the US, told me for the book that he doesn't believe there is a single local co-op running in the US right now. And he was kind of despairing of that happening anytime in the near future. It's very difficult to organize. There's a lot of bureaucracy that goes into it.
Yeah, if you Google the words my name, Simon Owens in Bristol, you'll see a Q&A I did with someone who created a co-op called the Bristol Cable, and they talked about how they went about it. But yeah, I don't know if I know if any local. I know of national news organizations like Defector Media and the Discourse blog and Brick Media that have done co-ops, and you could probably model it off of them. But I don't know of a lot of local news co-ops. I know we're winding down. Jeff, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, so I was new to the news industry starting a couple years ago, but I'm kind of think for local news, like Dan said, nonprofits seems to be the more the model with the most momentum. But I honestly think that the philanthropy's not go. I don't think it can provide the funding needed. So I'm curious if Dan and Ellen, if they think that the nonprofits ultimately is an unsustainable model for local news, and where do they come down on any of the government funding bills, that the other organizations are looking at pushing to help pay for news.
Yeah, and I think Ulrike, I think I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I might be wrong. She also had a similar question.
So I'll let Dan talk about the last question, but nonprofit news is documenting sustainability is a big issue for us at Brookline.News. But nobody asks the Museum of Fine Arts if it's sustainable. And so I think the answer is to demonstrate that you have one has a diverse sources of revenues that include philanthropy, but include that all important community connection with members, with small donors, with events that people come to. Maybe they're ticketed, maybe they're just fundraising events, with maybe some sponsored content, some corporate underwriting. So it's I think ideally philanthropy straight up should be maybe 30 to 40% of your revenue pie, but it shouldn't be all of it.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point.
And
Dan,
if the philanthropy can come from the local level, that makes a big difference. I mean, the Knight Foundation can't fund everybody, obviously.
Yeah.
The
Awesome.
other question was about some of these government programs. Well, there's two major bills. There's the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, which seemed to be dead, but kind of lurched back to life zombie fashion recently. We'll see if it actually goes anywhere. That is the bill that would empower the news business to negotiate with Google and Facebook to extract some revenues out of them. We'll see where it goes. I think it's kind of problematic. In Australia, it's mainly been served to further enrich Rupert Murdoch, and I'm dubious of it. The other is the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, which I think is more promising, and that would create 3 tax credits that would help local news, tax credits to subsidize either subscriptions or donations to local nonprofits. It would subsidize businesses that advertise in local news outlets, and it would subsidize publishers that either hire or retain journalists. And as proponents point out, that particular tax credit, even though some of it might reward corporate chain owners, it would reward them for doing the right thing. So maybe that's not necessarily a bad idea. On the federal level, there's no signs that that's going anywhere. But we've seen various efforts at the state level to implement similar tax credits. I know that there's a bill here in Massachusetts that would create the tax credit for subscribers, for instance. I don't think that these are necessarily a bad idea, but I really don't think there's any substitute for local news entrepreneurs, whether they're nonprofit or for-profit, making it work at the local level.
Yeah, I feel like we could spend a whole hour going onto these proposed legislation, like in Australia, Canada, California, and then the one also winding its way through Congress. But unfortunately, we're 7 minutes over, so I have to start winding down. Ellen and Dan, no pressure, but if you do feel comfortable, you can leave your email address in the chat so that people can follow up with you if you have any questions. Or I know there were some people on here that you might want to have on your podcast who are running really successful local media organizations. Well, thank you everybody for coming to this. This was another amazing office hours. We had some great contributions.